He was my strength, and now the world feels unbearably empty. I speak to silence now, yet I carry him.
My heart was broken, but I remained, because duty demanded that I live on.
If one small life had unfolded a little differently, the image of an entire age might have looked different too. Because this is not just the story of Queen Victoria. It is the story of a lonely little girl who was raised in silence, watched at every step, deprived of ordinary freedom, and grew into one of the most enduring women in history. The world remembers the crown, the empire, the black dresses, the title Empress of India. But behind all of that was a child who knew loneliness before she knew power, a young queen underestimated by older men, a woman who loved deeply, suffered deeply, and kept walking anyway. And maybe that is why her story still matters. It is a story about control, selfhood, love, grief, endurance, and the quiet kind of strength that does not need to shout to change the world. Before she became the symbol of an era, Victoria was born in 1819 at Kensington Palace. On paper, it looked like privilege, royal blood, palace walls, a future surrounded by ceremony. But emotionally, it was something else. Her childhood was not a fairy tale. It was cold, careful, and strangely lonely. Her father died when she was only 8 months old, leaving behind not just absence, but a kind of invisible wound. She was too young to understand loss, but not too young to grow up inside its shadow. That early emptiness mattered. It shaped the atmosphere around her. It deepened the sense that she belonged to something grand, yet had very little real warmth inside it. The palace was large, but her world was small. She had status, but not freedom. She was a princess, yet often lived like a child enclosed behind glass. And that enclosure had a name, the Kensington system. This system, enforced largely by her mother and Sir John Conroy, was designed to keep Victoria dependent. She was watched constantly. She was rarely allowed to be alone. She could not move freely, speak freely, or form an independent rhythm of life. It was control dressed up as protection. The goal was simple: shape the future queen into someone who would rely completely on the adults around her. For many children, that kind of upbringing might have crushed something essential. But in Victoria, it did something more complicated. It hurt her, yes. It isolated her, yes. But it also drove her inward. And in that inward world, a quiet force began to form. She read, she studied, she observed, she learned languages. She practiced drawing, she kept a diary. She developed a mind that was sharper and deeper than people around her realized. That is one of the great paradoxes of her story. The very system that tried to make her dependent may have helped create her self-command. The cage did not make her simple. It made her inwardly stronger. Her diary, especially, became a kind of private refuge. In a world where almost every movement was supervised, the page was hers. There, she could think honestly, feel honestly, speak honestly. Long before the world heard her voice as queen, she had already built an inner voice of her own. And maybe that is why she was more prepared than anyone expected. Because when the great turning point came, it came suddenly. On June 20th, 1837, King William IV died. Victoria was only 18 years old. One moment, she was still the young woman living under rules made by others. The next, She was told that she was now Queen of the United Kingdom. It is hard to imagine the emotional shock of that morning. No slow transition, no gentle adjustment, no chance to pause and become someone new little by little. Just a door opening, important footsteps, a death, and a crown. But what made that moment unforgettable was not only its drama, it was her response. The people around her expected hesitation. They expected fragility. They expected an inexperienced girl who would be easy to guide, easy to influence, easy to manage. Instead, what they saw was calm, a kind of stillness. A young woman who stood small in figure, but somehow larger than the expectations surrounding her. At her first council meeting, she was not lost. She was composed, clear, alert, present. That was the moment when the image began to shift. The lonely child from Kensington was still there, but now the room had to see something else too: resolve. Victoria's famous phrase, "I will be good," has often been remembered as something sweet and innocent. But it meant more than that. For her, good was not softness without strength. It meant responsibility, discipline, moral seriousness, a way of keeping herself steady in a life that had begun with instability. It was less a charming line than a quiet vow, and that vow became the emotional spine of her reign. Of course, a crown did not remove the pressures around her. She still entered a world dominated by older men, experienced statesmen, and assumptions about what a young female monarch could or could not be. But Victoria's method was not loudness, it was presence. She listened carefully, she spoke clearly, she made decisions with firmness. She learned quickly. In one of history's quietest but most powerful transformations, she moved from being treated like a controlled girl to being recognized as a capable queen. If the first part of Queen Victoria's life was about surviving control and stepping into power, the next part was about learning how to live inside a world that was changing faster than anyone before her had ever seen. This was the Victorian Age, a time of inventions, expansion, ambition, and enormous motion. Railways changed distance. Industry changed labor. Communication sped up. Cities grew louder, denser, brighter, and more restless. The modern world was beginning to take shape. And there is something emotionally striking about that contrast. Because while the century rushed forward, Victoria became the still point inside it. She was not the noise of the age. She was the anchor. The more Britain changed, the more her steady presence seemed to matter. That may be part of why she became so unforgettable. She did not need to symbolize speed. She symbolized continuity. In a century full of smoke, machinery, growth, and disruption, she looked like permanence. Meanwhile, Britain itself was expanding outward. Industrial strength helped fuel imperial reach. Faster ships, wider trade, stronger systems of administration, and improved communication allowed the empire to stretch across the globe with new confidence. In time, Victoria would be given the title Empress of India, and that title meant more than ceremonial prestige. It reflected the scale of the empire and the emotional transformation of her image. She was no longer simply a queen in London. She was becoming a symbol large enough to stand for an entire imperial imagination. And yet, even as the world saw her in grander and grander terms, the emotional core of her life remained deeply human. She was not just monarch. She was mother. Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and that fact changed how the public could see the monarchy. a crown can feel distant. A family can feel recognizable. Through motherhood, domestic life, and visible partnership, the monarchy became more human to ordinary people. It gained emotional texture. But family, in her life, was never only personal. It was political too. As her children married into royal houses across Europe, Victoria's family became a web of continental influence. Over time, she would be called the Grandmother of Europe, a title that sounds warm, almost tender, but carried enormous geopolitical meaning. Her bloodline linked thrones. Her role as mother became, in a way, another form of soft power. That is one of the most fascinating things about her story. She lived private life and imperial life at the same time. She moved through intimacy and statecraft at once. She held babies, wrote letters, felt jealousy, love, irritation, devotion, and also stood at the emotional center of a global empire. She was not balancing two worlds. She was living all of them at once. And through all this, the diary remained. That private voice, that hidden room of the soul. Through her writing, we can still feel how deeply she loved Albert, how intensely she experienced life, and how unlike a flat royal symbol she truly was. Because the diary proves something important. Victoria was never passive. Even as a child, under strict control, her mind had been alive. As a queen, a wife, and a mother, that inner life only became richer. The public saw ceremony. The diary reveals pulse. It shows that beneath the carefully controlled image stood a woman with vivid emotion, sharp thought, and a constant need to make meaning out of what she was living. That is why these writings matter so much. They are not just historical documents. They are evidence of a person. And in her education, too, we see the making of that person. Victoria's childhood had not given her freedom, but it had given her concentration. She learned French, German, and Italian. She read widely. She drew. She observed. She became intellectually capable in ways people often underestimated because of her size, age, and gender. There is something bittersweet in that. The world that deprived her of normal childhood ease also sharpened her mind. The loneliness cost her something real, but it also prepared her. When power arrived, it did not land on an empty surface. It met a girl who had already spent years building inward discipline. So when people later saw a small queen holding together a massive institution, what they missed was this. She had been preparing for strength long before the world knew it. And the institution she stepped into was itself changing. Britain, in the early 19th century, was already a major military and maritime power. But under Victoria, monarchy itself slowly shifted in meaning. It became less about dramatic personal rule and more about symbolic continuity, national identity, and moral presence. Her reign helped move the crown towards something emotionally modern, not raw domination, but durable significance. That mattered because her reign lasted 63 years. Think about what that means emotionally. An entire generation can change in 20 years. In 63, whole ways of living can disappear. And still, Victoria remained there. Through political turbulence, social change, industrial acceleration, expansion abroad, and transformation at home. Her duration became part of her power. She was not only ruling history, she was outlasting it. And that sense of continuity gave people something profoundly psychological. In a century that often felt unstable, Victoria could feel like a fixed point. A familiar face, a recurring symbol. an almost human bridge from one era to another. That is why the crown under Victoria became more than a crown. It became memory, stability, identity, but no amount of strength, partnership, symbolism, or routine can protect a life from the one thing that can still tear it in half. And for Victoria, that moment came in 1861, when Prince Albert died. Something inside her seemed to collapse with him. If this chapter is opening your view of her beyond the crown and into the woman herself, comment 1 below. Because the most painful and perhaps most powerful part of her story begins now. In 1861, Prince Albert died. With that loss, the emotional center of Queen Victoria's life was shattered. This was not ordinary grief. Not the kind that fits neatly into a few tragic lines in a history book. Albert was her husband, closest friend, and safest emotional home. He understood the crown's pressure better than anyone. He was her intellectual equal, daily companion, and most woven into her inner life. When he died, she didn't just lose a loved one. She lost the person who had helped make life bearable. She didn't hide her pain. Victoria fell into deep mourning, changing her public image for life. She wore black, preserved his belongings, and kept his rooms in ritual order. Memory needed visible form. The name, Widow of Windsor, became powerful. It was not just a label, but an emotional portrait. The world watched a queen in grief, a human trying not to disappear inside unbearable loss. That is the central feeling of her story. Not grand heroism or dramatic recovery, but endurance. Victoria didn't move on simply. She never stopped loving or mourning Albert. She learned, slowly and painfully, to carry grief without letting it erase her identity. That may be one of the bravest things she ever did. She continued while wounded. Anyone who has ever lost something irreplaceable knows how hard that is. Her life, in a strange way, can almost be seen through color. Once, she stood in white. Young, in love, stepping into marriage, giving the world one of its most enduring wedding symbols. Later, she lived in black, dressed in absence, wrapped in memory, carrying sorrow like a second skin, white and black. Beginning and aftermath, joy and mourning, love and memory. Those colors tell the emotional story of her life as clearly as dates ever could. And then there were the objects, photographs, keepsakes, even casts of Albert's hands. These were not merely relics, they were anchors, material ways of refusing to let love vanish. In that, Victoria becomes profoundly human. Grief often lives through objects, through fabric, through silence, through the things we cannot bear to put away. But what makes her story more than tragedy is what happened next. She returned. Not suddenly, not theatrically, not as someone healed. She returned as someone still hurting. Step by step, Victoria moved back toward public duty. Her sorrow became part of her symbolism. She was no longer simply the young queen or happy wife. She was a figure of endurance, a woman who had suffered in full view of the world and still remained standing. In 1876, she was proclaimed Empress of India. Her children's marriages deepened her role. The isolated girl of Kensington became a global symbol of continuity, family, empire, and survival. And maybe that is the full miracle of her life. Not that she avoided pain, not that she conquered every sorrow, not that history handed her an easy path, but that she kept going. From the lonely child trapped inside the Kensington system To the young woman who broke free and claimed her own space. To the 18-year-old queen who surprised a room full of powerful men. To the wife who finally found emotional partnership. To the widow who thought grief might consume her. To the sovereign who became the face of an era. Victoria's life was not a simple rise. It was a long act of becoming. That is why she still matters now. Modern life has its own forms of confinement, its own invisible systems, its own loneliness, pressure, expectations, and private losses. Most people will never wear a crown, but many know what it feels like to be watched, limited, underestimated, heartbroken, or forced to keep functioning while carrying pain no one else can fully see. And Victoria speaks to that. She reminds us that strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like writing in a diary when no one hears you. Sometimes it looks like studying in silence. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let a controlling world define your inner life. Sometimes it looks like grieving for years and still choosing to fulfill what life asks of you. That is her deepest lesson. Not perfection, but persistence. Not emotional neatness, but dignity. Not freedom given easily, but freedom built inwardly first. She began as a small girl in a cold palace. She ended as one of the most recognizable women in modern history. And somewhere between those two images lies the reason her story still glows. Because Queen Victoria was not just powerful. She was steady, like a light that does not go out, even in winter, even in grief, even when the world is changing too fast. And maybe that is the image worth leaving with. Not just Victoria the Queen, not Victoria the widow, not Victoria the Empress, but Victoria the human being. Wounded, disciplined, loving, lonely, resilient, who kept her light and kept moving forward. If this story made you see Queen Victoria in a deeper way, comment 9 below. And if you enjoy stories about history's most powerful people told through their real human struggles, stay with this channel. Because behind every famous name, there is always a deeper story.